Have you ever had somebody to say to you, well, I'd consider being vegan, but gosh, I just like to have a good time. Or, yeah, maybe you've got a good idea on all this stuff, but don't you ever just want to have some fun? Now, the vegans I know are very, very fun loving, and those are strange questions. And yet, the idea of putting this beautiful way of being in the world out to the larger world with a sense of joy is what we're going to be talking about today. Hi, everybody. I am Victoria Moran, your host for the Main Street Vegan podcast. Very, very happy that you're spending this time with us. Now, if you have been listening to the Main Street Vegan podcast for a while, some people have actually been listening since we started in 2012. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And you are probably listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and that is so cool. But what we've been doing for the past several months is also putting the Main Street Vegan podcast in glorious living video on YouTube. So you can check that out on my YouTube channel, which is currently called Victoria Moran Vegan. That might change because if people are put off by too much use of the V word, vegan, not Victoria, we may be shifting that. But as of now, as I speak to you in January of 2026, it's Victoria Moran Vegan. And that way you'll see the guest, you'll see me, you might see my little dog James, and makes it kind of friendly. So, however you are finding us, thank you for being here. And oh my gosh, I've been waiting to talk to this man for a really long time. I received a copy of his truly beautiful book, Hungry, Beautiful Animals, when it was brand new just over a year ago. It has the loveliest subtitle, The Joyful Case for Going Vegan. I like that, don't you? So here's a little bit about the author. Matthew C. Halteman is a professor of philosophy at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and a fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. He is the author of Hungry, Beautiful Animals and co-editor of Philosophy Comes to Dinner, Arguments about the Ethics of Eating. And he's a real fan of vegan desserts, but gosh, aren't we all? Welcome, Matthew.
It's so wonderful to be here, Victoria. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, it is an absolute pleasure. And anybody who's not familiar with the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics, do have a look at that. They're doing the most amazing things in academia, in philosophy, in religion, in really reaching out to places where thoughts take root and take wing. I remember when I was looking at college, the idea that one could study women's studies or some of these things now that are very, very basic, including animal rights, animal ethics, animal law. It just didn't exist. But it started there and then it ripples out into the world. So tell us a little bit about you, Matthew. How did you become this person that would write this book?
Well, it for most vegans, the story is long and it doesn't begin with vegan sainthood, does it?
Uh-oh.
So I am from agriculture on both sides of my family, at least a couple generations back. So my paternal grandfather was an egg farmer, and my maternal grandfather was a pesticide and herbicide chemist, good Mennonite stock from Eastern Pennsylvania. And so I grew up with, just an abundance of food. And, if you had told me 30 years ago that I'd be on a podcast with the famous Victoria Moran plumping for plant-based eating, I think I would have grabbed the nearest side of beef and licked it to spite you. This is not the future that I saw coming, but a combination of really serendipitous and timely events kind of colluded, literally ganged up. Members of my inner family got together and decided that I needed to pay much closer attention to these matters that I had never thought about before. And if there's one thing a philosopher loves, as you mentioned, I'm a philosophy professor, it's these sort of everyday things that we all do every day, but that we rarely take a step back and reflect upon. So when I discovered that 3 times a day I was engaged in this act that had far reaching ripple effects that were largely very, very negative, uh, without my realizing this. It really kind of changed the game for me in big ways, and it was a combination of sort of 3 people, one canine person, my dog Gus, who helped me to see that members of other species can be irreplaceable individuals with feelings and beliefs and deep, deep commitments to their relationships. Another was my wife, who dared to challenge us both to go vegan for about 3 weeks or so to see what that would be like. And then a fellow philosopher, Nathan Nobis, who once at a conference challenged me. I was eating a big French dip sandwich, and he says, and these are fighting words, "I thought you were a pacifist, buddy. Like, have you ever looked into what's going on with that sandwich?" And of course, I hadn't. So that combination of things in rapid succession, a dog kind of turning on the emotional lights for me, a philosopher dropping the intellectual gauntlet, and a life partner saying, look, it doesn't have to be social death. We can eat beautifully in a way that's much more aligned with who we are. And yeah, those 3 things together. It took all 3. I don't think the arguments or the emotions or the food alone, none of those would have been powerful enough. I'm too lazy for that. So it took all 3 of those emotional, intellectual, and social parts really to get the ball rolling for me. And that was, gosh, 21 years ago or so.
Wow. That's a lovely story. I also wanted to recommend a book to you of another woman who grew up in a Mennonite family in agriculture. Her name's Diane Waltner. Her book is called Evolving into Wholeness.
Oh,
She
wow.
grew up working on the place where they take the baby turkeys and raise them. I don't know, hatchery or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, she's still in Kansas, Wichita,
Uh
Kansas.
huh.
And I love the stories. I mean, the backstories are amazing, both because they're really interesting, but also because the big question is why you? Why Diane? Why me? Why not everybody else out there? And I love how you talked about you got the triple whammy. And
Right.
maybe that's what it takes. It's not just seeing one thing that affects one part of the personality, but really getting it from the emotional, the intellectual, the gustatory. So, well, that's wonderful. I'm so glad that happened for you 21 years ago. So, tell us a little bit about what it's like to be you. I know you teach philosophy, you've written this lovely book, and what's life like these days?
So I think as a philosopher, I mean, one of the things you run into is that there's this kind of, we like to be armed to the teeth argumentatively, right? And we don't like to go off half cocked when it comes to the reasons that we hold for the things that we believe. And at least when things are going well, we like to be true to the values we claim to hold. One of the things that I try to do with my students, is leave them with this challenge to be the change they want to see in the world, right? To really take up those gauntlets that are dropped and try to live as authentically as they can toward the values that they most cherish. But there's also a tendency in philosophy, I think, sometimes to prioritize the argumentative aspects and sort of the intellectual aspects, sometimes to the detriment of some other areas that we really need to be growing in if we want to come into a more holistic understanding, right, of why these choices make sense not just in terms of the reasons we hold, but in terms of the feelings that we have and in terms of the relationships that we are working within. And if there's one thing human experience has taught me, not just as a philosopher, but as frankly a really emotional person, right? Doing a lot of compensation, right, for the various ways in which my emotions and my social concerns and, my physical desires are kind of driving the bus, even though I'd like to be a perfectly rational person, or I once aspired, right, to have always the arguments running the show. I think what I've learned as I've gotten older is if all we have to bring to the table is the arguments, not only are we not likely to succeed in providing the most invitational, holistic vision, right, of what going vegan can be like, but often, at least with the majority of people, we can end up doing more harm than good because there's this phenomenon that social scientists have learned about, and it comes as sort of bad news to philosophers, right? That identity protective cognition, right? This phenomenon of when you hear facts and figures and arguments that you don't like that cut against the grain of your comfort or security or the approval of the gatekeepers in your community, it doesn't matter how compelling the arguments are. In fact, the more compelling the arguments are, the more likely you are to dig in, right, to the assumptions that your identity desperately needs to be true in order to sort of feel like you can stay in the comfort and security and approval of the people in your community. And so I kind of learned, right, a good ways into my philosophical career, yipes, these arguments that I've been relying on so heavily in my outreach efforts, in a lot of cases, might be doing more harm than good, right? They might be triggering people's identity protective cognition and making it even harder for them to find those windows and doors, right, into transformed consciousness. And so as I've gotten older, I've learned that, wow, the arguments can be important to some people, but often it's the emotional life, the social life, the physical desires, the moral concerns, more than the kind of intellectual arguments that are really running the show. And so, if we really want to be truly hospitable to the people we're engaged with, friends, family, the world at large, we have to take a more holistic approach. We have to engage all those different parts of where people are. And sometimes that means prioritizing the feelings or prioritizing the social possibilities or prioritizing physical needs. Because until those physical, social, and emotional parts feel enough comfort for the defenses to come down and the mind to be a bit more open to what is on the table, it does more harm than good to bring the argument. So, as a philosopher, I would say that's one of the strangest features. You ask what it's like to be me. And I think one of the strangest features of being a philosopher is you're trained to hold arguments in such incredibly high esteem and you're armed to the teeth to give the best arguments out there. But sometimes you're undertrained at being empathetic with right what people are feeling rather than just what they're thinking, or you're socially used to being able to kind of really challenge people at their deepest levels of commitment when people just don't feel comfortable with that kind of challenge. So I'd say that's been one of the most interesting sort of quirky features of being a philosopher, is sort of finding out halfway through my career that the thing that I was trained to do with the utmost rigor might actually be in some cases doing more harm than good, and then having to pivot to a more holistic way of thinking about advocacy and hospitality.
Well, I think that's true for all of us. Just because we want people to change so much, especially those of us who are in it for the animals, it's please, please, please. And maybe we're not as trained in argument as you are, or some of our wonderful attorneys are, but we want to argue anyway. And I've just got to tell you, I love it that you're a philosopher. And I don't know what you put on your income tax there where it says profession, if you put philosopher or professor. I remember reading in high school that only 12 people actually say to the IRS, my profession is philosopher. And I don't know if that was true then or if it was ever true, but I just remember thinking, ooh, I want to be something that only 11 other people do.
Well,
And for people who are watching this on YouTube, I just want to say all those books you see behind him, that's not a backdrop. Those are his actual books. Now, that's proof of you being a philosopher. So super cool. So you have a couple of concepts in the book that I really want to delve into because you're taking this from a very different perspective than so much that we read in the vegan world. You talk about the value of a shift from obligation to opportunity. Tell us about that.
yeah. So this is really a beautiful question as a follow-up to what we were just talking about, because I think when you're dealing with arguments, typically what they're trying to do is leverage, right, beliefs that people already have into some notion that whether they realize it or not, whether they like it or not, they're obligated, right, by these beliefs that they already hold to live in this new and often very intimidating way, right, they think, right, when they're first starting out. And so I think in the vegan movement at large, for very good reasons, because these are very serious problems, because animals don't deserve the treatment they're getting. It's a matter, right, of justice to care about the lives of other creatures and to prevent their suffering and to work for their flourishing. So it makes sense that we would frame this as Tom Reagan does, right? As Peter Singer has, as Carol J. Adams has, in terms of a moral obligation, right, to change the way we think about animals, to change the way that we live toward animals. I think they're absolutely right to do that. And in my work, I've done a lot of work along those lines as well. I do believe there is obligation here to change the way we live. But when it comes to inviting other people to consider these things, I think it's often more helpful to start with the opportunities that going vegan hold out to people, right? Rather than, muscling them into seeing, look, you're living this conflicted life. Aren't you ashamed? Don't you realize that you should pivot because you have this obligation to do so? What if we thought instead, well, think of all these things that you value in your life, right? You value physical health and strength. You value, right, being intelligent. You value being compassionate. You value working to see to it that the least of these people who are oppressed are receiving the attention and the care that they need. You value a beautiful planet, right? These are all things that you value. What if going vegan was a joy aggregator rather than a moral obligation, right? What if you went vegan because you deeply desire all these beautiful things that going vegan will put you in touch with, right? And I think that is such a powerful invitation, because when you think about the difference between feeling obligated to do something and deeply desiring to do something, it's a very stark difference in terms of the motivational matrix there and your power actually to do something. I mean, one of the examples I use with my students sometimes, we call them thought experiments as philosophers, but imagine that you're sitting on the couch in your Netflix sweatpants, you're watching TV, and the thought occurs to you, I have to clean the bathroom before the company arrives tomorrow afternoon. And you're sitting there, and the last thing in the world you want to do is get up and clean the bathroom. And if you're like most people, you're going to sit there for as long as possible until something like shame moves you to do the requisite cleaning. Or if you're like me, you might just shut that bathroom door and put an out of order sign on it and never get around to it. But now imagine that you're in the same sweatpants watching the same Netflix show, and the thought occurs to you, holy smokes, there's an 8-inch square of tiramisu left over from last night's dinner party sitting in the refrigerator right now. It takes absolutely no motivation to move, right? You are out of the couch, you're up to the refrigerator, you're halfway through the leftover tiramisu in two shakes of a lamb's tail, right? You don't need motivation or willpower or resolve because desire is on the job. Your desire for that delicious next bite of tiramisu is doing all the motivational work. So my thought is, what if we tried to get a pitch for going vegan up and running that prioritizes all the things we have to look forward to, all the things we have to love about this way of being in the world? I loved how you described it in the intro as a way of being in the world. That's really what it is. It's a way of being in the world that activates all these opportunities for harvesting beauty in our physical bodies, in our social relationships, in our moral commitments, in our intellectual lives. And so that's what I have in mind, right? Instead of focusing on the obligation, which I think a lot of great philosophers have shown very compellingly, it's there, right? But instead of starting there, what if you started with all the beautiful things that we learn? Those of us who have maybe started from obligation and then lived this path and realized this is everything I've ever wanted and more of it than I was getting before I made this change. Why not start with that, right? With the fulfillment of desire rather than the looming obligation.
I bet your students love you.
I hope so. Not always, maybe, but yeah, I love the classroom.
So I think when most lay vegans think about veganism and philosophy, we think about Pythagoras. Is that somebody that you give much thought to? How did he look at this whole thing?
I don't know a whole lot about the ancient history of the vegan movement. I know that, you know, Pythagoras had thoughts about animals and the transmigration of souls and the importance, right, of doing right to every spark of the divine. I know that Plato was concerned about these matters, that the republic, that, the ideal society envisioned in the republic was apparently vegetarian. I know that Plutarch and others, since the dawn of Western philosophy, have seen, right, eating animals as morally problematic. But I don't study, right, the history of philosophy as much as I do the contemporary stuff. And
Okay.
so I'd like to have something more interesting to say about Pythagoras in particular, but that might be a question for a historian of philosophy who's paid a bit more attention to what our ancient progenitors have to say about these really important matters. Sorry to disappoint. One thing I've
Now,
learned as a philosopher is that if I have no idea what's going on, the last thing I'm going to do is fake it. So I just admit the limits of my expertise when I
well,
come
that
up
that
against
is
questions.
admirable. Yeah, I think it's probably in so many ways similar to just what we're dealing with now. I do have a copy, and I have not read it all the way through, of a book called On Abstinence from Animal Food
Mm.
by a philosopher named Porphyry, if I'm even
Oh yeah.
pronouncing his
Mm-hmm.
name
Mm-hmm.
right.
Porphyry.
And
Actually, I
what's
think
so
that's who I meant to say when I said Plutarch.
okay,
Porphyry. Yeah, you
well,
you
what's
got
so
it.
interesting is he's writing to a friend of his who gave up on being vegetarian. And he's trying to make all these arguments like you were such a great philosopher and you were so on the right path. And do you really think Zeus would approve of that? And it's like, here was a guy talking about Zeus making the same kind of argument that we do so often with somebody who's like, yeah, I tried it.
I mean, I think, one of the things I talk about in Hungry Beautiful Animals in the third chapter, you're right, Victoria. Like this is stuff that human beings have seen for a very long time. And it's actually kind of easy at the end of the day, right? I mean, in chapter 3, I talk about the moral foundations of going vegan really being kindergarten ethics, right, is the term that I use to describe what motivates all this. And I think sometimes that can get lost in the shuffle because when philosophers bring the more complicated arguments to the table, um, you know, you can get the impression that, oh, I need to accept a bunch of sort of weird metaphysical views about animals, or, oh, I've got to have these really sophisticated ethical theories. I have to know what consequentialism is if I'm going to follow Peter Singer. I have to know what deontology is if I'm going to follow Tom Reagan, or I have to be right really seasoned and sophisticated in feminist care theory if I'm going to read Carol J. Adams. And I highly recommend reading all those authors. I never would have gotten where I am in my own spiritual journey, much less my vegan journey, without those very important three people and many more. But at the end of the day, you don't need all that fancy philosophical apparatus to get to the big ideas here, right? It's kindergarten ethics. The things that make us desire a vegan world are things that we learned when we were knee high to a grasshopper, right? They're things like if somebody's in pain, you help them, or right, you try to be who you say you're going to be when you show up as a friend, or it's probably better when you're dealing with somebody different to be curious rather than defensive, or what, it's better to be honest than to kid yourself about what's really going on. I mean, these are things we teach kindergartners. And they're things we teach kindergartners because you can't really function, much less flourish, unless we've all sort of agreed on these really basic assumptions about what needs to be in play in order to live the good life. So I don't think it's any surprise that people in, ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Rome or ancient Athens, we're talking about these things in down to earth terms, because I think they're things that anybody who's read Charlotte's Web and found themselves cheering for Wilbur can easily see, right? And to see that this is the case, just imagine any normal parent's response. If their child's reaction to Charlotte's Web is, I thought about it and I really want the butcher to win. I'd like to see Wilbur on a plate with some béarnaise sauce and Charlotte scrunched under somebody's foot. I mean, you're taking that kid to therapy immediately, right? If that's the response. And so kindergarten ethics is really all we need to motivate the big ideas here and to find ourselves desiring a vegan world.
Wow, that's beautiful. So let's talk, speaking of beautiful, about Hungry Beautiful Animals. When I first saw the book, I thought, oh, it's going to be scary. It's going to be about all the terrible things that I already know about, so maybe I don't need to read it, particularly because of hungry as the first word. So talk to us about the title.
Yeah. So I realize the title is a little, I mean, when people complain online about this book, they say he's trying to be poetic. And I guess I'm guilty because I've been writing for eggheads for all these years. And this is my first opportunity to write for everybody, right? And so I was kind of trying to be maybe a little bit too literary, but I found it really beautiful to think about the fact, at the beginning of the book, I was thinking, what do all creatures have in common, right? No matter what species they are. And it occurred to me that what we all have in common is that we're hungry, beautiful animals. So
Mhm.
on the one side, we have these bodily desires, right? There's this hunger that pushes us forward into a world that pushes back. And when we're honest with ourselves, we realize it's that hunger is responsible for our ability really to be here at all, right? If we didn't have desires, we wouldn't last very long, right, as a species. And so those desires are really, really important, that we go out into the world grasping for traction, right, is something that all members of all species have in common. At the same time, we're all animals, right? There are these very strict animal limits that push back on us, right? So we might really love to do this, that, and the other, but we're embodied creatures. And whether we realize it or not, whether we like it or not, there are just things that are ruled out for us from the get go because of our animal natures. We are finite, we are error prone. No matter how much we desire this or that, we always have to contend with the limits, right, of our animal nature. And so the thought was is this hunger that pushes forward, and there's these animal limits that push back. And what hangs in the balance is our beauty, our flourishing, right? We
Mhm.
flourish to the degree that we find a way to balance the hunger that pushes us out into a world that pushes back, and the animal limits, right, that say to us, you can only go so far. And so I love that idea for human beings. I mean, I think other animals kind of realize that, whether or not they consciously realize that, it is another question, but they seem to do a better job than human beings at staying in their animal lane, as it were, right? Their desires and their animal natures seem to be more properly aligned. Where I think human beings sometimes, because of the incredible capabilities we have, the hunger tends to vastly overmatch, right? That sense of limitation, that sense of healthy balance. And so, what Hungry Beautiful Animals is about is inviting human beings to see what we have in common with other creatures and to recognize that the best way to go if we really want to be our most beautiful selves is to bring that hunger and that animal limitation into a more harmonious balance, right? And to live as hungry, beautiful animals, recognizing our limits, recognizing that our beauty depends on respecting those limits, which means, right, creating space for symbiotic relationships with other creatures and for space for them to flourish on their own terms rather than always letting our blind desires make all the decisions in ways that then degrade us and degrade the world around us.
Mm, lovely. So interesting you're talking about the hunger and the desires that move us, because anybody who is watching on YouTube, this is new to me, so I keep referring to it, might think I have some sort of twitch or something because I keep providing little treats for my dog so that he'll stay quiet and be a good podcast producer.
Well, I'm
And
very happy to have him speak up. I did a podcast with Jamie Woodhouse from Sentientism, and we had a whole episode chatting with his dog who became very vocal. And I love being interrupted by dogs,
oh,
especially my own. And so, yeah, if you run out of treats, I'm very,
okay.
very happy to share the platform.
Well, I'll either run out or just stop because I know his little tummy has had plenty. So you talked in some of the stuff that you sent me about wanting to be a better salesperson for your own brand. What is your brand? Tell us what you really would love to be selling out there.
Yeah, so I guess my brand is trying to find a way to help others really sell their brand with
Mm,
authenticity. I mean, one of the key ideas, especially in the third part of Hungry Beautiful Animals, is that there's no one size fits all, right? Everybody's inner family is different. So I think we all, in various ways, encompass these different facets, right? We all have physical bodies. We all have social relationships. We all have emotional needs and valences. We all have intellectual commitments. We all have a vision of our moral good. But how those different parts of who we are interact between and among themselves is vastly different from person to person. And one thing I've learned as a teacher, right, is that what you say to someone whose inner family is largely dominated by their emotions or largely dominated by their social relationships is really, really different than something you say to somebody who's largely dominated by physical needs or concerns or say intellectual needs or concerns. And those things differ from person to person. And
tell
so the
us. May I? I'm sorry to interrupt,
Not at
but for
all.
people who aren't familiar with the concept of inner family, help us understand what that is.
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have said something about that. But yeah, I've been influenced a lot by an approach to therapy called internal family systems therapy. And this is a psychologist from Harvard, Richard Schwartz. And if you're interested in kind of getting the big ideas, he has a wonderful, wonderful book called No Bad Parts. And the big idea is that we are all, to a certain extent, plural minds, right? Our lives are, if you've ever had the feeling, right, and I think with food issues this becomes even more salient, right? Because your gut wants a burger and your heart wants to nuzzle a cow, and your head is sort of bobbling back and forth between defending your old habits and trying to find the gumption to cultivate some new habits, while your climate anxiety sort of hangs by looking with disgust at the whole mess, right? I mean, we all have these really complicated different facets of who we are, and they want different things, and they're motivated by different things, and they feel different ways about different kinds of inputs. And I think we've all had this experience, right, where we hear an argument and we think, wow, I find that really intellectually compelling. Socially, it's a non-starter, right? Or, oh, I see this video and I feel emotionally terrible that animals are treated this way, but I feel like I've got these arguments from my religion that say that human beings were given animals for food, and who am I to argue with God, right? So we've got these kind of inner tensions that are generated by the different ways that these different parts of us come into interaction and are related to one another. And I think in our culture, we've been so bullied into the idea that the self is transparent and harmonious and unified, right? And what we should all be shooting for is this monolithic picture of the self knowing itself and living in a perfect accord with its ideals. And so that sort of trains us away from allowing this inner complexity, from listening to the different voices. And what tends to happen is, based on the way we've been shaped, we'll choose one or maybe two of these inner parts and elevate them above all the rest. So for some of us, maybe the intellectual is what we most want to be. And so we stuff all our emotions and we compromise our social relationships because the intellect is more important. And for others, right, our emotional experiences are what feels like the divine intervention, and we don't much care what the arguments say. Um, or for some of us, it's our social relationships that matter above all else. And so, even if something is intellectually compelling, right, or emotionally vivid, if it cuts against the grain of what we think our friends and family need, it's a non-starter, right? So that's what I mean, right, by the inner family. That there are these different parts of who they are. They're all deeply engaged in the process of helping us to be who we are, and they all ultimately want what is good for the whole in the end. But because they have different ways of experiencing the world, because they bring different perspectives to the table, it often manifests as a fight. It's like Thanksgiving with your inner family. Everybody's got their own need to have it their own way, and chaos ensues. Yeah, that's what I had in mind. Sorry, I wasn't clear about that from the beginning.
Oh, I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to ask because that is utterly fascinating. And thank you. So, everybody, isn't this a great conversation? My guest is Matthew Halteman, and the book is Hungry, Beautiful Animals, The Joyful Case for Going Vegan. And you can find the hungrybeautifulanimals.com website. And on Facebook, it's a little trickier, so I'm going to put that on the show notes at mainstreetvegan.com. And Instagram, we've got Hungry Beautiful Animals. So let's look up the book, buy the book, read the book, and look up Matthew Halteman. So let me ask you something that goes a little bit beyond veganism. Because you are in philosophy, you are in an academic setting, you're around young people. And we are in the age of social media, and so many people are saying that the youth are lost because they're always on a phone. Are the youth lost? And how about
Boy,
the rest of us? And what do we do in this particular time just with ourselves? And then we'll bring it back to veganism.
yeah, so I think, one of the things I've learned as a philosopher is that big universalizing blanket statements usually turn out to be false or at least much more complicated than they initially look. And for that reason, I've never been a big fan of kind of generational pronouncements, right? Gen X is like this, and the millennials are like that, and Gen Alpha's got this new set of problems. I think there are so many counterexamples to these meta narratives, so many classes full of people who are on a social media fast because they see how damaging it's been, right, for some of their peers, or because they're recovering themselves from various forms of addiction that they want to be rid of. I mean, I guess I see wisdom and desire and goodwill mixed in, right, to this generation every bit as generously as I've seen it, in the 20 years that I've been teaching. So, I don't think, I do not think this generation is lost. In fact, I think that they've had an opportunity to see the ways that some of the previous generations, including their parents and grandparents, have been careless with things, right? Whether intentionally or not, that now require an intense focus and a moral earnestness that is becoming increasingly pressing. So I'm hopeful, when I look at what this generation has to offer. Having said that, of course, right, every generation faces risks that the previous generation didn't face, and it certainly is true that I wonder sometimes how we can mitigate the use of AI in the way that it kind of curtails people's ability critically to think for themselves. And I have concerns, right, about when social media tempts people to spend more time in a virtual world, right, than in the real world outside. But once again, right, it's certainly not just the present generation that faces these temptations, right? I find myself involuntarily reaching into my pocket in that 5-minute walk from my car to my office, right? Even though there's absolutely nothing pressing to see, right? My hand and my brain have colluded to force me to look at this stupid phone. And so I guess, yeah, I really like the advice. A wise person once said, right, let's start with the planks dangling out of our own eyes before we look for the specks in the eyes of others. And I think, speaking too freely and broadly about any one generation um, maybe takes our eye off the planks hanging out of our own eyes. So I'm very try to come from a place of humility when I'm talking about the challenges my current students face.
Ah, very good. And how open do you find your students to some of these ideas about animals?
Yeah, so I find them incredibly open as a rule. I've been teaching an animal ethics class here at Calvin since 2005. I offered it every year for probably 12 years or so, and then we had some curricular adjustments. We used to have a 3-week seminar between the fall and the spring that was like an intensive, and that was kind of the slot that it fit in. That went away, and now finally, after a couple of years off, I've turned it into a 200 level class that pretty much anyone can take, whether or not they're philosophy majors. And I'm astonished at how open people are to these ideas. Um, but at the same time, given what I said about kindergarten ethics, a few minutes ago, I think that's really right. I can't take any credit because these are ideas that most of my students have been committed to for a long time without realizing it. Maybe it's played out in their relationship to their pet, or maybe it's played out right in the way that they treat other human beings and they haven't made that extension yet. But, after the initial shock that some people have when they discover what's really going on, because of course it's difficult these days, given that the three biggest lobbies in the world, right? I mean, agriculture and oil and pharmaceuticals all have a vested interest in making sure, right, nobody uh, discovers what's going on. And of course, I saw two of your most recent guests talking about, right, the new FDA guidelines, right? And there are lots of efforts afoot to make sure that people, right, aren't aware of what's happening. Once students get over that initial hurdle of just the shock, right, of how bad this is, and how deeply it violates the things that they hold for true and good and beautiful, it's really beautiful how far they're willing to go. And, I'm not suggesting that everybody goes vegan overnight or even that everybody sees that as the moral ideal, but it's not a hard sell at all to get people to realize that our contemporary food system is morally indefensible and that we all have both a duty and an opportunity to take bold steps in new directions. That I think people have a pretty easy time taking on board for the most part.
I love that. And I love it that you're teaching at a liberal arts college in the Midwest. Is it Presbyterian?
It's Reformed, so
Okay.
it's associated with the Christian Reformed denomination. Thankfully, Calvin is a place where we have a wide diversity of ideological perspectives. I think sometimes Christian colleges are known for being quite narrow in their outlook, but one of the things that I've always loved about being here is that I have colleagues who are very progressive and colleagues who are quite conservative, but there is a willingness and indeed a relish, right, for learning from one another across our differences. And that's something that can be difficult to find at both a large university, right, or a small school that's more like a think tank, right? These days we all are kind of circling the wagons wherever we find ourselves. And I really like it that Calvin is a place where you're going to be challenged by different outlooks on things. And we also have a great deal of international students as well. So it's a melting pot too, from the standpoint of people coming from different parts of the world with
Mm.
different outlooks on things. And so I just made a post the other day. I'm super excited. We have a lot of South Korean students at Calvin, and I'm very excited to announce that the Korean version of Hungry Beautiful Animals is coming out this month. And so next year, when I teach the class again, my Korean students will have an opportunity to read one of the main course texts in their native language, which is really exciting. And I don't have any, well, do I have any Brazilian students? Because the Brazilian edition is coming out in February. So I should be able to offer students from other places an increasingly rich opportunity to read it in their own language.
That is the most exciting thing as an author when you start seeing your book in languages and scripts that you can't read, but you know somebody is. That's thrilling. Well, I hope you sell lots and lots and lots of foreign rights all around the world. And I love hearing about Calvin. I went to a North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, which is a United Methodist school. And just as you're describing, there was just so much richness, so much conversation, so much respectful debate. And then in my junior year, I got a fellowship to go to the UK and study vegans because at
Oh,
that time
wow.
there were more of them there and they were in a smaller landmass. And as part of a degree in comparative religions, they sent me to England for a month. And I got to meet some of these people from the 40s who had been there when they didn't really know if they would die in a month. It was just the ethical thing to do, so they did it. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, I know North Park very, very well and have any number of friends who went there because I grew up just a 40-minute ride in Wheaton.
Oh
So,
my gosh,
yeah.
that's where I was living.
Is
Are
that
you?
right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I lived, first I lived across the street from the College Avenue train station.
You're kidding.
I am not
That's where
kidding.
I lived, maybe in the same apartment building, the Crestview Apartments, right across from the thing in apartment 12A.
Oh my goodness. Oh, you
Can you
can't make
believe
this
that?
stuff
I
up.
know.
That is so you well then you're still living in the north, but my memory of living in Wheaton on College Avenue and not having an enclosed garage was putting the heater next to the
Oh my goodness.
engine every night because it got cold. Well, isn't that funny? And then we moved a little bit up to Carroll Stream,
Yep.
and that's where my daughter was born. So how
How interesting. Yeah, I saw
interesting.
North Park on your bio and I thought, "Oh my gosh, I wonder how much West suburban experience she has because we could have a lot of stories to exchange. Maybe not all of them exciting to your listenership, but yeah, we have that'll be an interesting thing maybe to talk about more offline because it's definitely a very interesting slice of life in the American Midwest, I think.
Well, the American Midwest has is for everything that we say about a reticence, generally Midwestern people, Southern people, to take on something new, and maybe more of a tenacity to hold on to some of the older ideas. That's what gives us groundedness and stability, and I'm really grateful to be from there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I found that there's a kind of earnestness too, you know,
Yeah.
and a reluctance to give up on things that you hold dear. And there are downsides to that, make no
Mhm.
mistake. But yeah, I am a very proud product of the American Midwest, and that definitely comes through in Hungry Beautiful Animals. That I'm a West suburban Chicago boy, and my accent has gotten quite a bit more relaxed, I think, in Michigan. But one of my friends from high school sent me a video last week, and I mean, I sounded like one of those super fans, Bears super fans from Saturday Night Live in the '90s. I cannot believe how much my accent has shifted. But yeah, once a Chicago boy, always a Chicago boy.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, tell me your favorite team, and then we'll move on to being
Well,
philosophical and vegan.
so I'm not a big Chicago sports fan because my whole family is from Pennsylvania, and so I
Oh,
inherited my dad's love of the Philadelphia Phillies and the Philadelphia Eagles, and so I grew up not really liking the Cubs, even though all my friends were diehard fans, because the Cubs used to take the Phillies' best prospects, you know, at the rookie or a couple years in, and then so there, I'm not a big Chicago sports fan, but my
okay.
love is world football. So I'm a big supporter of the Arsenal Football Club. And in fact, to get back to Hungry Beautiful Animals, I actually
Yeah.
had to find a way to shoehorn references to Arsenal into the book because I was like, this might be my only chance, right? To have a book that like more than 8 people will read. And so Kai Havertz, who is one of Arsenal's players,
Yes.
one of his main philanthropies is a donkey sanctuary, and he's very much right
Wow.
a friend of the animals and has donated quite a lot of money and supports one sanctuary in particular in Germany that his parents are heavily involved in. And so, yeah, I had to get that reference to Arsenal's animal advocate into the book. So,
Oh,
how's that for a
that's
far fetched way to bring the sports chat back into contact with?
no, I love it. And I think it's so important for us as vegans to show that we do have some interests that don't have anything to do with being vegan. And you're talking about Arsenal and that, you remind me of Martin Rowe of the Culture and Animals
Oh
Foundation.
yes.
And Martin has written some beautiful books, deep books about animals, but he's also written a book about cricket and baseball, or maybe it was two books, one on cricket and one on baseball. I don't know. But we're whole people. And I think to
Absolutely.
get that message out is another way to be joyful with this, as you write about so magnificently in this book. So thank you. Thank you
Well,
so much for your time. Thank you for being a philosopher.
well, it has been a real joy. And boy, on my top 10 list of things that I discuss with Victoria Moran possibly living in the same apartment building
Yeah,
as
we'll have to
college
talk about
students
that
was
more.
not on that list. So that was really a joy. I mean, I do
That's
love
pretty cool.
the small
Pretty
world
cool.
serendipity. We are all connected. And I
Yes,
think the
we
more
are.
the more reminders we have of how our well-being and our desires and especially our just our desire to have joy, right? And to experience solidarity with others. And that's, I think, my favorite thing about going vegan is just how it just explodes, right? The possibilities for that joy and solidarity. So
Mm.
it's been a real pleasure to be here, and I'm
Oh,
so
thank you
grateful.
so much. Well, maybe they will invite me to speak at the Grand Rapids Veg Fest again one of these
Ooh,
years and we could
is
meet. And
oh,
certainly if you
absolutely.
come to the Big Apple, I love living in the Big Apple. It's such a vegan nickname. Um,
Paradise.
Let me
Yes.
know. Okay, everybody, thank you. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being part of this. However you listen, we'll put all of the ways that you can find Matthew and his wonderful work on the show notes at mainstreetvegan.com. And in the meantime, let's just all go out there and make Main Street vegan.